Let's take a look at the heart valves in more detail. So right here, you can see the mitral valve. This is the left side of the heart. Here's the left atrium and the left ventricle. So right in this box here where the bicuspid valve, also known as the mitral valve, would be, we're going to zoom in on that, and you see this larger picture here. And you can see the valve itself as well as the chordae tendineae that tie it down to the papillary muscle. Now, 80% of the blood in the left atrium is going to passively go down into the left ventricle. When the atrium contracts, it's only squeezing the last 20% down through this mitral valve and into the left ventricle. Now that you're looking at the left ventricle here, it is going to contract in order to push the blood out of the ventricle and up and into the aorta through the aortic valve. Now, if you watch my mouse at the bottom, you can see here's the left ventricle. When it contracts, it's going to increase pressure on the blood in this chamber. Now, when the blood pressure increases, the blood is going to push up on the underside of the mitral valve. And by pushing on the underside of the mitral valve, it actually closes the valve. By putting pressure on the underside, the valve flaps close, preventing blood from going back into the atrium. Now, this valve would blow backwards into the atrium under the high pressure if there were not chordae tendineae tying it down. Now, this blood pressure in the ventricle is going to get higher and higher as the myocardium continues to contract until the pressure inside the ventricle exceeds or is greater than the pressure of blood in the aorta. And when the pressure in the ventricle exceeds the pressure of the blood in the aorta, it'll force this aortic semilunar valve to open, and blood will leave the left ventricle and enter the aorta. So now you can see blood is exiting through the semilunar valve. This example happens to be between the right ventricle and the pulmonary trunk, but it's the same concept where the blood pressure in the ventricle exceeds the pressure in the artery here. The semilunar valve will open, blood leaves the ventricle and goes out into the major artery. Now, once the ventricle stops contracting because the blood has entered into the major artery here, then the pressure in the ventricle will drop, because once contraction stops, the pressure will drop, at which case the blood is going to want to move from an area of higher pressure to an area of lower pressure. Blood is going to want to move back down into the ventricle once the ventricle relaxes. But these semilunar valves, when they get pressure of blood exerted on this side of them, it forces this semilunar valve to close, and blood cannot drop back down into the ventricle. And then the cycle repeats. So here we're going to have deoxygenated blood going out through the pulmonary semilunar valve into the pulmonary trunk when the ventricle's contracting. When the ventricle relaxes, blood will want to drop back down, but they'll force this semilunar valve to close. Remember, with our AV valves, that stands for atrial ventricular valve. So AV valve is the valve between the atrium and the ventricle, which is going to be the tricuspid valve and the bicuspid valve. Collectively, these are referred to as atrial ventricular or AV valves. Remember, 80% of the blood from the atria are going to drop down into the ventricle. When the atria contract, the last 20% gets squirted down into the ventricle. The ventricles contract, blood pressure increases as the myocardium is contracting and putting a force on that blood. Blood will want to push up against the AV valves. It will force the AV valves to close so that blood cannot go back up into the atrium. Instead, the pressure will be exerted on the semilunar valves, and it will open those valves and blood will go out into the major arteries. Here is a GIF, a GIF image. You're looking at the mitral valve here. So the left atrium is above this valve. You can't really see it. When the valve opens, blood will come down into this way, into the left ventricle. Here's the tricuspid valve. You can see the tie downs here. 1, 2, and 3 back in this way. Tricuspid valve. When the ventricles contract, then your semilunar valves open. Here from the right ventricle, that would make this the pulmonary semilunar valve, and this artery here, the pulmonary trunk. You'd have deoxygenated blood. From the left side, you're going to exit the aortic semilunar valve into the aorta. You can't see that because it's behind this flap of tissue here. Note the interventricular septum separating the right and left ventricles. This down here is the apex of the heart. It points slightly left. Up here where all these tubes are entering and exiting the heart, the flat portion at the top is the base. So don't forget our pulmonary circuit and our systemic circuit. Sometimes valves can be leaky and blood can shoot back through valves when it shouldn't. When this happens, the valve is considered incompetent or insufficient. If this happens due to a defect at birth, then it's called a congenital birth defect. Sometimes valves can be damaged by disease. Endocarditis is one example. Endocarditis is when you have an inflammation of the endocardium. Remember, the endocardium is the inside lining inside the heart where the blood flows inside the chambers. Endocarditis can be caused by bacteria. There was a case in the news not too long ago where somebody had a dental issue and they didn't see the dentist in time, and bacteria got into the blood supply from the oral cavity. And once bacteria was in the blood, it traveled to the heart as blood is pumped through the heart, and it hid out just on the underside of the valves. And when bacteria starts to grow in there, it can damage the endocardium. You get endocarditis, inflammation, and it can damage valves that way. Heart murmurs is the terminology that we give to sounds that are abnormal that can be caused by an insufficient valve. So if blood is leaking back through the valve, you can hear that, and that sound is called a heart murmur. Stenosis means a hardening. So if the valves become hardened and they don't function as well, that's called a stenosis. Valve replacement can be done with a synthetic valve or pig heart valves, because pig hearts are very similar to ours in their structure and function. Here you can see the right ventricle and the left ventricle, again coming back to the idea that the right ventricle myocardium is much thinner than the left. Remember, the left ventricle is what's pumping oxygenated blood out the aorta and to the rest of the body, going all the way up to the head against gravity, as well as all the way down to the feet. So the myocardium on the left ventricle has to be a lot thicker, has to increase pressure of this blood a lot higher. When we look at pressures a little bit later on, the right ventricle pressure is going to be much lower compared to the left. And you can see that in the myocardium there. Remember, structure equals function. So we've been talking a lot about the pulmonary circuit here, with the pulmonary trunk branching out into the pulmonary arteries and taking deoxygenated blood to the lungs so that gas exchange can occur. Oxygenated blood comes back through pulmonary veins to the left side of the heart. And then for the systemic circuit, taking oxygenated blood originating here at the aorta out to multiple different arteries that branch throughout the whole body. Gas exchange happens here with all the tissues and the different systems that you learned. This is the systemic circuit, and then bringing deoxygenated blood back to the heart, and this cycle repeats. The one circuit that we have not talked about yet is how the heart muscle, the myocardium, gets oxygen and nutrients itself. Now, the heart is a muscle made up of cardiac muscle tissue. These cells need a lot of ATP in order to do all of the contraction. So you're going to need oxygen and nutrients to the heart muscle itself. Now, you might be thinking, can't oxygen diffuse from the left side of the heart here into the tissue? And the answer is no, it's much, much too thick. Remember, diffusion happens across capillaries. So you need to service the heart muscle itself with capillaries to give oxygenated blood and nutrients to these cells. And this circuit is called the coronary circulation. From the left ventricle, which is going to pump oxygenated blood to the body through the aorta. Here's the aorta here, major artery. The very first thing that branches off the aorta, you might think, are these three top little nubbins here where the blood vessels have been cut short. But that's not actually the first branch off the aorta. The first thing off the aorta is the coronary arteries. The heart feeds oxygen to itself first, behind the pulmonary trunk, but coming off the ascending aorta here is the left coronary artery and the right coronary artery. And what I want you to note is that out here, these coronary arteries are bright red, and over here it looks like it's been ghosted or shadowed. It's not as bright in color. We call this ghosted, and what that means is that it's showing you the structure which is hidden. It's there, but you can't see it. So this part of the artery is underneath other tissue. Remember, left and right from the patient's perspective. So coming off of the ascending aorta, you have the right coronary artery. This is on the right side of the heart, and the left coronary artery coming down from the left side of the heart. The left coronary artery, once it peeks through underneath the tissue and you start to see a bit of it, it doesn't exist for very long before it bifurcates, which means it splits. What it bifurcates into is the anterior, because we're on the anterior surface, interventricular, because it's running between the ventricles, artery. Anterior interventricular artery. Now note that the left coronary artery is from here, if you follow the arrow, down to here. Once you have a bifurcation, the name changes. Coming down the front, originating from this bifurcation right here, this is the beginning of the anterior interventricular artery. Another name you can say for beginning is the proximal location. This is the proximal anterior interventricular artery, which makes this the distal anterior interventricular artery. Proximal, remember, is proximately close to the point of origin. Distal, think distance further down. But if I were to ask you to name this artery, you would just say anterior interventricular artery. Where the terminology proximal or distal come into play is if you're trying to tell somebody where a blockage is inside of the artery, then you would say proximal or distal to give location on the artery. Now your textbook will list this as anterior interventricular artery. That is really the terminology used in an anatomy course. If you go into a clinical setting, remember they always like to abbreviate things to say things faster. Instead of the aortic semilunar valve, it's just the aortic valve, right? There is also an abbreviation for this anterior interventricular artery. It's referred to as the LAD, L-A-D, and what that stands for is left anterior descending. So left because it's coming off of the left coronary artery, anterior because it's on the anterior surface of the heart, and descending because blood's descending downward. So left anterior descending artery. Okay, or LAD, L-A-D. You can choose to call this the left anterior descending artery, or you can choose to call it the anterior interventricular artery. It's the same thing. Now, when this left coronary artery comes down and bifurcates, from here to here, you have the LAD. Over here, this is given a different name. If you look at this artery, it wraps around the circumference of the heart and it goes to the back side. Notice right here, this is ghosted. It's kind of shadowed or shaded differently. So here's the anterior surface. It wraps around and goes to the back, at which point you're seeing the posterior surface of the heart in the shaded, ghosted area here. This is the circumflex artery because it goes around the circumference of the heart. Coming from the right coronary artery, which remember also will branch off of this aorta. The right coronary artery just follows along the right side of the heart and will wrap around to the back side. You can see it's ghosted back here. This is the posterior surface. Coming down off of the right coronary artery, we have the right marginal artery. This is the largest artery coming down toward the apex when you're looking at the right side of the heart. When you're looking at all these little arteries coming off of the right coronary artery, the largest is the right marginal. Now, if you think about the margins of a paper, right? When you're making a Word document and you want to make the margins narrow or wide, that's the margin. It's the edge of the paper. This is the edge of the heart here, so right marginal artery. Now, if you follow the right coronary artery around to the backside, to the posterior surface of the heart, which is why it's ghosted here, you're seeing what's behind, you can see that it merges into the circumflex artery. Here's the circumflex artery. It's coming around the front, wrapping around the back, and it's merging into the right coronary. This is called an anastomosis. Spelling is right here. It's a junction of vessels where they meet. Anastomosis. This is singular. If you're talking about more than one, it's an ES on the end, anastomoses. If you're looking at the posterior side of the heart, you're looking at the ghosted vessels here that are actually on the back side. Coming down this way, you have the posterior interventricular artery. The naming matches up very nicely with the anterior interventricular artery. One is anterior, one is posterior. Just keep in mind that the anterior one is also called left anterior descending or LAD. You can see there's an anastomosis between the posterior and anterior interventricular arteries. So there's two anastomoses for you to learn here. Here's a picture of the heart where you don't have any ghosted sections. So you know that if you were to peel away this pulmonary trunk, coming off the ascending aorta, you would have the right coronary artery, which you see peeking out right here, and you would have the left coronary artery. Now you can't see it because it's behind this pulmonary trunk, but it would be coming off the aorta, and where you finally do see it is poking out right here. This little tiny bit is all you're seeing of the left coronary artery. Now, it's going to bifurcate. It's going to split, which means right here is the end, the distal end of the left coronary artery. This is where the LAD begins, which you're seeing here, and where the circumflex artery begins, which is what you're seeing here. Looking at the right coronary artery coming down the side, the right marginal artery. Let's go ahead and take a look at the coronary veins. These are going to be returning deoxygenated blood back to the right atrium once the heart muscle has used up the oxygen. Now in front here on the anterior surface, this is called the great cardiac vein. It's going to wrap around the back. Notice it's ghosted. This is what they're showing you. It's on the posterior surface. Right here, there's an enlarged section where blood starts to pool. This is called a coronary sinus. It's on the posterior side of the heart. And the coronary sinus is what all of the coronary veins merge into. Then the coronary sinus takes this deoxygenated blood and dumps it into the right atrium. Remember that the right side of the heart is what's collecting the deoxygenated blood. The right ventricle pumps the deoxygenated blood to the lungs so that you can pick up oxygen. The right atrium, remember atrium is always the receiving area. The right atrium is going to have three things dumping deoxygenated blood into it. Three. Number one is the superior vena cava, bringing deoxygenated blood from the superior part of the body like the head and neck. Underneath, bringing blood from the legs and the abdominal cavity, you have the inferior vena cava. You're not seeing it here, but it's underneath. It's going to be dumping blood into the right atrium as well. And the third thing dumping blood into the right atrium is the coronary sinus. So 3 entry points for deoxygenated blood to come into the right atrium. From there, it drops down through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle, out the pulmonary valve to the pulmonary trunk, pulmonary arteries, and will go to the lungs to drop off CO2 and pick up oxygen. Then that blood will come back in through the left atrium, mitral valve, left ventricle, aortic valve, out the aorta, and the first thing that comes off the aorta is the right and left coronary arteries. Right here, this is a posterior view of the heart. You're looking at the back side, and here you can see the great cardiac vein and the coronary sinus. Here's the superior vena cava bringing blood to the right atrium, inferior vena cava bringing blood to the right atrium, and the coronary sinus bringing blood to the right atrium. Angina pectoris at the top here, this is a terminology that we use for the sensation that somebody feels when their heart is running out of oxygen. If you have a blockage in one of the coronary arteries and blood's not getting to the tissue, the myocardial cells will start to die. They need oxygen, they're running out of ATP. They need oxygen to make more ATP through aerobic respiration. If they're not getting it, the cells cannot function without ATP. So a signal gets sent from the heart to the brain, and the way the brain interprets that, the sensation that you get is the feeling in the chest that feels heavy like an elephant sitting on the chest, and that sensation is called angina pectoris. So how do body cells make ATP? This is Bio 32 review. We start with glucose, which is a 6-carbon molecule. We undergo glycolysis in the cytoplasm. We result in 2 pyruvic acids, each of which are 3 carbons long. Now, if you have oxygen, then the pyruvic acid is going to go into the mitochondria, and you can make 36 ATP, some water, some heat, CO2 is waste. So when you started with 1 glucose, if you had oxygen available, you made 36 ATP. Now, if oxygen is not available and you don't have enough, then the pyruvic acid stays in the cytoplasm and you end up undergoing anaerobic glycolysis. You only get 2 ATP from that glucose molecule, and you get lactic acid as waste buildup. If you're looking at glucose and you're only getting 2 ATP off of 1 glucose, this is not enough for myocardium, cardiac muscle tissue to survive. It's not enough. Going back to your Bio 32 material, actin and myosin is going to form a cross bridge, and in order for the myosin head to unbind off from actin, you have to have ATP there. If you do not have ATP, you're not going to be able to continue to shorten the sarcomere. Remember that ATP is also required for the calcium to be pumped back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. The myocardium of the heart has to have enough ATP, which means it has a high oxygen requirement. If you don't have enough oxygen, you get that angina pectoris sensation, and you have a heart attack, which is referred to as a myocardial infarction. And I'll put that up on the screen in just a minute. Remember, there's also another function for ATP. Here is the cell, inside the cell. There's a sodium-potassium pump here, which is using ATP to pump sodium out of the cell and to bring potassium in. Sodium is higher outside the cell, lower inside the cell because of this sodium-potassium pump, which uses ATP. Sodium wants to go from an area of high quantity to an area where there's less of it. So if you run out of ATP, this sodium-potassium pump stops working. Sodium diffuses into the cell. Water follows. Just like water follows sodium when we look at the kidney, when we looked at aldosterone. If sodium enters into the cell and the cell cannot pump it out because it doesn't have enough ATP to do so, the cell will swell. If the cells of the heart, the cardiac muscle cells, start to swell because they're filling with water, you're getting cellular edema. Then the myosin and actin start to separate due to the water in that cell, and now myosin can't reach actin because they're separated due to the swelling of the water. This is called a heart attack or a myocardial infarction. MI, myocardial, coming from the myocardium, and then infarction. Why does somebody have a heart attack? Well, it's any blockage in the coronary circulation that prevents the blood from flowing down the coronary arteries and getting to the capillaries of the tissue. Any kind of blockage in here will prevent oxygen delivery to the tissue. So if you look here, gray is the fluid, and then right here, it looks like a little bit of a white area. That's a higher density material. It is atherosclerotic plaque, and blood cannot get through there. Blood cannot move downstream from that point. So what they did is they performed an angioplasty with a stent. They inserted a stent in there. It pushed the atherosclerotic plaque up against the wall of the artery and opened up the diameter. You can kind of see the border of the stent right there. You can see the sides of it. This is the left coronary artery. Here's the circumflex artery. Here's the left anterior descending. You can see here in the lab, there's a buildup of atherosclerotic plaque. It's narrowing the passageway. Blood's not flowing through here as well. So what they do is they take an angioplasty, this balloon. A stent is the black mesh network here. They inflate the balloon. It pushes up against the atherosclerotic plaque, opening this area again and giving it structural support so that blood can resume flowing through that artery. This is an emergency surgery where it is extremely time sensitive. So myocardial infarction, that's the scientific term for a heart attack. There's various different treatments. One is a vasodilator. Vaso referring to blood vessel, dilating, making the blood vessel larger so that blood flow can go through there better. For this, you can use a nitroglycerin tablet. You put it under the person's tongue. It is lipid soluble, so it can go through the phospholipid bilayer of the cells lining the mouth and get into the blood through the blood vessels under the tongue. Angioplasty with a stent. This is what I just showed you with the balloon and the mesh network, opening that blood vessel back up. Another treatment would be a coronary bypass. This is when you go around the blockage rather than fixing the blockage. And you'll be looking at that in more detail in lab. And lastly here is if it happens to be due to a blood clot, you can give a clot-busting enzyme like tissue plasminogen activator. You have a post-lecture assignment. You're going to be tracing a drop of blood through the heart. So the post-lecture assignment will give you a starting point and an ending point. You're going to start with the starting point and then say, what will it go through or in next? For instance, if I say that you are a blood drop in the superior vena cava, you're ultimately going to the aorta. Then you would say all the structures that you would go through. So the first one, I said superior vena cava. From there, then you would draw an arrow, and the next structure would be the right atrium. Draw an arrow, and the next structure would be the tricuspid valve. Draw an arrow, the next structure would be the right ventricle. And then the pulmonary valve, then the pulmonary trunk, then the pulmonary arteries, and that would take it to the lungs. Remember, we're going through the pulmonary circuit here because I started on the right side of the heart. Coming back from the lungs, you go through the pulmonary veins. Then you would enter the left atrium. Then you would drop down through the mitral valve. Then you go into the left ventricle. Then you would go through the aortic valve, and then you would be in the aorta. Okay, so this is a trace a drop activity where you're naming everything that you would go through from point A to point B. That is your post-lecture assignment for today.